Great job. Great job. So on to our keynoters today. Dan Knoll and Audrey Scott are the husband and wife team, photographer and writer behind Uncornered Market. And they share their experiences with the world and humanize all different parts of the world through food and culture and photography. And they visited 75 countries and counting. And we can't wait to hear the adventures they're going to share with you today. So please welcome Dan Knoll and Audrey Scott.
I like that groovy music. Can everyone hear us?
Yeah? Do you have a sound check? We actually didn't do this beforehand, so hopefully you guys can hear us.
First off, a note of thanks. Thanks to all the folks at TBEX for organizing such a terrific event, and all of the sponsors. And finally, a big round of thanks to all of you who managed to show up to this audience. And so, yes.
Yes, thank you.
Give yourself a round of applause.
Especially we saw sunshine earlier and we thought, oh gosh, we're doomed.
So the reality is the bronze award goes to all of you who happen to be tired. Please go ahead and raise your hands. Yeah. Now, who here happens to be still hungover? You get the silver award. Now, this is going to be tough. I've got light in my eyes. The gold award goes to those people that managed to get themselves here and are still actually drunk. No, that wouldn't be me. I'm totally sober, at least I think I am. You know, if someone had approached us 7 years ago when we began traveling around the world and blogging about it to keynote a travel blogging conference, we would have thought that they were nuts. And we would have parsed the sentence and we would have gone into it and said, travel blogging. Now what's that? Of course, at the time, this is 7 years ago, this is the Stone Age, right? There were a few travel blogs around, but there was certainly no travel blogging industry.
And if someone had said there's going to be a travel blogging conference, we would have thought, well, what would you really talk about there? I mean, what's a conference for with all this?
And us keynoting? I mean, I'm glad that someone has a good imagination. Again, my name is Daniel Knoll.
And I'm Audrey Scott.
And we are the folks behind Uncornered Market. And we're also married, so that means during the course of the discussion tonight, this afternoon, we might actually be interrupting each other a few times.
Because that's just what we do. Those of you who know us know it's kind of par for the course. It's also how we say sane, traveling together 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
And I also have to offer a note of apology. If it sounds like I have a frog permanently installed in my throat, I'm recovering from a bit of a cold and a sinus infection, so I apologize. When people hear that we've been traveling around the world for almost 7 years, they ask a few questions, and one of the first questions that they ask is, how on earth do you guys manage to stay married? And unfortunately, we don't have a good answer for that, so we're not going to offer that today. But one of the other questions that they ask is, where did you grow up? And since Audrey's upbringing is infinitely more interesting than mine, she gets to go first. And she tells a story of growing up as a child of American diplomats in places like India and Sri Lanka and Cameroon and Gabon and Ivory Coast and Tanzania. And so with great expectation, the people then turn to me and they say, so Dan, where did you grow up? And I say, Scranton, Pennsylvania.
I'm glad that actually worked in this crowd.
So for those of you from North America, you'll recognize that as the home of the American version of the television show, The Office. Yeah? And so for those of you from the United Kingdom, I basically grew up in the American version of Slough. Now, for those of you from anywhere else who don't know those places, just pick the darkest, drabbest, dreariest place where you come from with the worst reputation, and that's where I spent the first 18 years of my life.
And he's not bitter.
But I'm not bitter. But something remarkable happened. After we traveled for a couple of years, we were on the road, I think, for about 2 years, and I returned to Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I began to look at it in the same way that I'd looked at all these beautiful exotic places that we had seen around the world. And I had taken photos, and I had engaged people and asked for stories and things like this. And people asked me at the end of that visit back to my hometown of Scranton, they said, what have you learned while traveling? And I said, well, one of the greatest things that I've learned is that every place has its own unique sense of something, its own beauty, its own stories, and its own history, and it's really up to people like us to find it. And it's really a function of sort of the lens that we put on or the glasses that we put on in order to find it.
Now, as you know, we're American, and we hope you don't hold that against us, because we do have quite a long history in Europe, if this actually moves. Okay. Maybe. About 15 years ago, I moved to Estonia, and I lived there for 2 years. I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I actually was not in the beautiful city of Tallinn. I was about 60 kilometers south in a place of about 3,000 people. As Dan mentioned, every place has its own beauty, but unfortunately I couldn't really find any great photos from my town, so you just get to look at Tallinn. And after 2 years there, Dan came over, he joined me, we backpacked around Europe for 5 months, and we got married in Tuscany. And in fact, just a few days ago, we celebrated our 13th anniversary.
Woohoo! Notch up another year. And I can definitely recommend it, not only getting married in Tuscany, but also getting married to Audrey.
But actually, perhaps is quite apt. We were just arrived that morning in Berlin from Boston, so we were jet lagged. We were both sick, and so we made a pact. We're like, okay, we're not going to celebrate we're not going to celebrate our anniversary now. We're actually going to celebrate it while we're taking a road trip around Ireland this week. So we're very excited for a road trip, very excited to celebrate our anniversary. And then after that, at the end of 2001, we left San Francisco and with no jobs, with 6 suitcases, and we moved to Prague. And we ended up working and living in Prague for 5 years. And then at the end of 2006, we sold everything again, put on backpacks, and started traveling around the world. And then we were homeless by choice, for about 6 years. So we were completely nomadic, just our bags, until last year when we decided to set up a base in Berlin. And so
those are not my leotards, and that is not me.
So this is now, Berlin is a place we call home. So we feel very much at home at Europe. It's where we've actually spent most of our life together, is in Europe and in traveling around. Now, how many of you have trouble kind of describing what it is that you do as a travel blogger? And we have a little exercise to maybe think about that. So how many of you have trouble describing what you do? I see a couple hands going up. Okay.
All right, well, before we dig deep into that, I'm going to ask you all to put down your devices. And what I'm going to do is, after we're done with this exercise, I'm going to re-invite you to re-engage with those devices and make sure that you tweet absolutely everything magnificent that you hear during the course of this presentation. But for now, put down the devices for a moment. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. Really, I still see eyes open, and I need those eyes
closed. We've got a message
closed.
for you, for those guys who your eyes are open.
Don't open your eyes. I'd like you to take a deep breath. It's been a long conference, a lot of drinking, a lot of networking, a lot of drinking. You take another deep breath. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to access your very first travel memory. Sit with that for a little bit. Think about when that was. Think about where it was. Think about what brought you there. Why did you end up there? And I'd like you to go a little bit more deeply into that travel memory that you've accessed and think about the senses that are engaged by that memory. What did it look like? What did it sound like? Were there any smells associated with that? Sit with it for a little while longer, and now you can go ahead and open your eyes. Hopefully that was a nice experience. Now I'm going to hold you to this and ask you to exchange with your neighbor that travel memory that you just accessed. And so we'll give you about a minute to do this. The idea is find someone next to you and share that travel memory that you just accessed, and then give the other person a chance to share theirs with you. Should hear lots of chatter, yes.
Okay, so just a few more seconds now. If you guys can hear me.
Wow, okay, you guys have really taken to this in a way that we didn't anticipate.
Yeah, we could probably just get off the stage right now and just let you guys talk for the rest of the time.
So can I ask everyone, all right, that's good. Well, you guys all really dug into that. A heck of a lot more than we expected.
So how was that? Kind of cool. Now 3 things just happened here. You had an experience. You went and you accessed that travel memory. And maybe that experience brought you back to that place and that time. But even just accessing that travel memory was an experience in and of itself. And then you shared it with someone. And then because you shared it, you created a connection with someone. And perhaps it's someone that you know already. So maybe you learned something new about that person, that connection got a little bit deeper. Or maybe it's someone that you've never met before in your whole life, and now you have a special connection with that person. So in a completely offline, non-technical way, we just simulated the travel blogging cycle, where we go and we have an experience. We go and we share it, and then through that sharing, we connect with people all over the world. And so it's a pretty cool. So every time everyone thinks of like, what is it that you really do as travel bloggers? Think about this. Think about what you're doing.
Which brings us to our first act. What is it that we do as travel bloggers?
Now, I know that I struggle to answer this question sometimes. And as I saw when I asked the question earlier, there's a few of you, I think, who do the same. And so what is it that we really do as travel bloggers? I mean, beyond the technical, beyond the fact that I use WordPress and you use something else, or beyond the fact that my favorite social media platform is this and yours is that. I mean, really, what is it that we're doing with as travel bloggers? Now, imagine trying to explain all that to someone who is 97 years old, who is completely lucid, very well traveled, but has never been on the internet before. So no idea of Facebook, no idea of Twitter. And with that, you get my grandfather. Here he is. He's cute, isn't he? Now, every time I go visit my grandfather in North Carolina, he's so sweet. He's always telling me how proud he is of me. You know, he's always telling me, I'm so proud of what you're doing. But then in the second breath, he says, now, what is it that you do again? And this has been going on for about 6, 7 years now. And so I usually sit down and I try and explain, you know, this is what we're doing. And, you know, he's seen us speak, and my father every now and then prints out articles for blog and brings it over to his place so he gets to read some stuff. And my grandfather is an incredible storyteller. I mean, he's one of the inspirations for us. Every time we visit, he has some crazy story of something that happened on a boat ride from San Francisco to Japan in the 1950s. I mean, and every time that I think that I've seen and done a lot, I think back to my grandfather, and his memoir is actually called Around the World in 80 Years. So as you can see, our 7 years, like, we've got nothing on him. Now, this last time I went and visited him, we had the same conversation. You know, he told me how proud he is of me. And then again, now, what is it that you guys really do? And so I sat back and I told him about some recent travels that we'd had and some people we met, some stories we were sharing. I was telling him some work we were doing with the Responsible or Sustainable Tourism Organization and what we were trying to do there. And his eyes got bright, and he kind of sat back and he's like, okay, I figured it out finally. You guys are interpreters. You guys are interpreters of experience. And I sat back and I said, yeah, actually, that is what we are. That's what we do as travel bloggers. We're interpreters of experience. We're interpreters of a place. We're interpreters of people. We're interpreters of culture. And through that interpretation, we're able to break down these barriers, perhaps break down some of the fears, and build a bridge and connection that perhaps would have never been there if we hadn't built it for them. And so with these conferences, it's great to network, and it's great to get around all sorts of travel bloggers and industry and everything else. But it's also sometimes interesting to get outside all this. And if we seek perspective in the unlikeliest of places, it might actually provide a little insight as to what we're really doing beyond the technical, beyond and we're at our laptops and on our phones right now. So sometimes it's good to do this, seek perspective.
So the question I have is, how can we elevate our interpretation of experience, or the level at which we do that? And that brings me to Act 2, or the how. And the other question I have is, how can we better merge our artistry and the sense of our artistry with our sense of business? And so this brings me sort of to the next step. How many of you have been faced with someone who has said, isn't it great that you get paid to travel? Okay, how many here see that as a gross oversimplification of what it is that we do in this industry? Yeah, so at the core of that, for me, is this idea that that I travel really inherently, fundamentally, has no value for anyone on this earth, really, until I'm actually able to interpret the experiences I have and then share them with someone in a way that resonates. And so I was thinking about this, and the other thing that we are often approached with is, isn't it great that you get to follow your passion and you somehow make a business out of that? And I thought, well, this is actually it's a little bit more complicated than that. And over the last several years, through our own entrepreneurship, talking to other entrepreneurs, reading books, we've come up with sort of a brief model that hopefully expands beyond this oversimplification. And it starts with passion. And the bad news is if all you have is passion, then all you really have is a hobby. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. After all, that's all that some people want to do, is go after a hobby. But if you want to go after a business, then really the next step that we found that you have to pursue is how to take your passion and then parlay that into skills. And so what we did is we took our travel for passion and we learned to become better communicators, better writers, better photographers. We understood social media a little bit more. But the reality is skills aren't really enough either, because you have to unlock value for someone else. So you have to unlock value either for your readers or for your partners that you're working with, or maybe you're providing consulting to other organizations. And the reason that you want to go ahead and unlock that value, aside from the fact that it's a good thing for the people that you're working with, is they're going to pay you money. And what you realize is when they pay you, you get a little bit of freedom, and then you can take that freedom and then plow it back into the passion that you've been concerned with this whole time. And we'd like to think is that the foundation of all this is a sense of purpose. And so that really sort of kicks off this sort of portion of our discussion of the how.
Now, over the last couple days, we've had a lot of workshops. Even before TBEX started, there were writing workshops. Earlier today, I was in a great workshop with Don George. And we all have this goal of producing great content. And I would say right now there's a bit of a trend in that there's so much content going out there, not only from bloggers, but also from other websites, and there's content farms, and there's so much content that's going out there that I think there's a risk of this idea of the commoditization of content. And the idea behind that is if we're not able to make our content stand out, then it can be easily replaced. We can be easily replaced. You know, and the idea is that someone cheaper can come in or can be basically taken over by someone else. And so we have this differentiation dilemma. But it's actually more of an opportunity, I think, for all of us, because all of us are traveling in different ways. All of us have our different niches. All of us are honing in on our skills, whether it's video, it's photography, or it's writing, or some combination of the three. And so even though it is a challenge to try and stand out, the idea is how can I differentiate myself in not just travel blogging, but in terms of my readers in order to keep them. And there's also a lot of, if anyone's been on the Facebook forums for travel bloggers, you realize that there's a lot of discussion on every side. And some people say that, you know, if you're on a sponsored trip, there's no way that you can actually produce great content, or if the only great content out there is on independent travel. And I think that's actually bunk. I think anytime that you're out there traveling and you actually focus on the stories and you focus on connecting, you can produce great content no matter what. It's up to you, and it's up to finding that differentiation. But how do you really do that? And with that, that's where the power of story comes in. We've had, again, a few sessions this weekend already, or week, I guess. But think about it. Our audience, our readers, are bombarded with about 6,000 messages per day. And that statistic is about 2 years old.
So it's probably 60,000 messages per day by this point.
So, you know, we have this challenge of everyone is bombarded all the time. So how do we get our messages across? How do we get our stories across? And that's where storytelling does come in. And we're not going to do a workshop on storytelling techniques. You've already heard from Mike earlier, and there's also other people like Don. But the idea with storytelling is the reason why our brains retain messages better is with story. And don't ask me why, but they've done scientific results. And so how can we place, as we're sharing the experiences, as we're interpreters of experience, place our readers deep in that emotion, deep in that experience, so that way they're not only just inspired, but the idea is how can we use our storytelling to actually motivate them to act? And I'm not up here as, you know, an evil corporate person. I'm not saying even that we're inspiring our readers to go out and spend lots of money and put their credit card down. But it's even how can we motivate them to act in terms of perhaps engaging with their neighbor in a better way or a different way, or perhaps going across town to a part of town that they thought was dangerous or bad, or even perhaps trying food that they might have never ever tried. But it's bringing down some of those fears and barriers and kind of saying, okay, it's not just inspiration is great, but I can say that motivating someone to go and do is really divine, and that's where the power of story and what we do can really make a difference.
So that brings us to our next story. I'm intrigued by this photo because I wonder what this guy has in store for the rabbit sitting next to him, particularly with those brown leather gloves on. Does anyone recognize who this is? Germans in the audience, please pay particular attention.
All right.
So you do, that's good.
A few people.
Okay, a few people. It also shows that you can be very successful without being very well known amongst a group of travel bloggers in Dublin, Ireland. This guy's name is Torsten Havener, and I'd like to talk about him because there are some things that we learned from him in terms of blending artistry and business. And what Torsten does is he's basically a professional magician turned mentalist. So he's a mind reader, and so he does these large shows for consumer audiences and for business audiences. He does it in Germany, he does it around the world. In fact, he's so prolific that when we were traveling in Japan last year, we were startled to see a large poster of his face on a Tokyo subway. And the other reason I bring him up is he was Audrey's roommate 16 years ago. He also attended our wedding and managed to make us disappear, much to the dismay of all of our guests. But he managed to bring us back. But the real reason that I bring him up is early in his career, before any sort of level of success, and before I had any interest in anything entrepreneurial, I said, Torsten, what's your approach to this business as an entertainer? And he said, I tend to place business first. I see myself first as a business person and then as an entertainer. And I said, that's interesting. So how does that sort of carry itself out? And he said, before I ever go into a negotiation or a meeting or anything like that, what I do is I dress in a Hugo Boss suit. And I said, well, why do you do that? And he said, before I go into that meeting, people are expecting me to be this sort of disheveled artist and being disorganized. And so I go into that meeting and I beat expectations and people are surprised, and that gives me an advantage. I said, wow, that's kind of interesting. And I'm not suggesting that we begin dressing in Hugo Boss suits, but I think if we can see ourselves equally as artists and as business people at the same time, it might actually do a good stroke, not only for us individually, but also for us as an industry. But this, but the story doesn't end there, because Torsten eventually became a little bit more successful as a mind reader, and one thing started happening. He began affecting his audience members so profoundly that many of them began to send emails offering large sums of money if he could put them in touch with his dead relatives. And he was tempted by these large sums of money, I might imagine, because he was just getting started. He was not terribly successful at that point. He had bills to pay, like many of us can understand. He had a family to take care of, so it was tempting. But before he decided whether or not to accept these large sums of money, he began to consider, what would this do if I accepted these large sums of money in doing this? And the reality was, he knew he didn't have any special powers. He couldn't do this. He thought about his audience and he said, you know what? It was more important, my integrity, more important the trust that I had with my audience, and more important what this is going to mean, this decision is going to mean for the long-term health of my business. And I could sort of leave the parable there, but I'm actually going to put a fine point on it and be a little bit more explicit. For those of you just getting started, maybe you've experienced this so far, maybe not. It's a heady moment when you're just getting started and companies begin to approach you with amounts of money. And you think, wow, this is really fantastic. And maybe they ask you to do a sponsored post or bury some link deeply embedded somewhere in a post or somewhere in your website. And it's really tempting because you're thinking, well, now I'm beginning to make a business and I can make money. And I'm not going to tell you whether to say yes or no to those emails. But what I will suggest is give it some deep thought before you give an answer, and consider the trust and loyalty of your audience and the long-term health of your business before you do it. And the question I'm going to leave you with is, on this note, is what if we say no to the short-term gain for the long-term interest?
And that gets us to the third act, which is the who. So as travel bloggers, or a travel blog, who is it that we're really serving? I mean, we all came from speed dating yesterday and today, so we know our demographics, we know the numbers. But when you're creating content, do you have a person in mind? I mean, maybe that person has a name, or maybe you actually can think of, who it is that you're writing for, that you're really hoping is going to take this trip, or who's going to act on what you're writing about. And this isn't just in terms of our readers, but it's also the partners that you work with as well. And we have 2 stories from New Zealand for this, the first of which is Tom and Jess, cute couple that you see right here.
I love these guys because they're from the United Kingdom. They're from Liverpool. Jess is from South Liverpool, so we could barely understand anything that she had to say. And things were so grim because Tom was from North Liverpool, so she had to act as his interpreter.
But after about a couple weeks.
But you spend a couple of weeks with them and eventually you get the sense of what they're saying. And once we began to understand what they were saying, we came upon this story.
And so for Tom and Jess, this was the first tour they'd ever taken, this tour in New Zealand. And Jess was really, really nervous. I mean, she told me that she was really worried she'd just spent all this money, and she was worried that she might not like anyone on the tour, and she was afraid of water, and we kept doing these water activities, and yeah. And so I asked her, I said, well, then how did you end up here? What is your story? And she explained that she'd been saving money for about 10 years. When she was 16 years old, her grandmother traveled to Australia and brought back some souvenirs, and she got it into her head at that point that someday I'm going to travel to Australia. So she worked 2 jobs throughout university. After that, saved a bunch of money when she actually got kind of a real job. And Tom, her partner, saved for about 6 years, and then they finally took off to Australia, and then they came to New Zealand. That's where we met them. And so I got in touch with Jess, and I said, do you mind if we share your story? And also I want to make sure that I have the facts straight, because as you know, storytellers, sometimes you start elaborating things in your head, and you want to make sure. No, I never do that. But Jess ended up writing me this great letter and this great email, so instead of me trying to summarize it and butcher it, I think I'm just going to read it. So Jess writes, all my friends have moved up the career ladder. They've bought houses and are settling down. If we had stayed at home, we would have had a healthy deposit for a house. But I am so glad we decided to blow all that on traveling the world. We've met some incredible people who I hope to stay in touch with for a very long time and have done some amazing things. Before New Zealand, I was afraid of boats, would you believe? Now I just love them. If I'd stayed home, I would have probably still had that fear. We've been working in Sydney for nearly 6 months now and have saved quite a lot. Last week on our way to work, Tom and I were talking, and again, if we were to go back to the UK, we could afford a deposit on a nice house. For about 5 seconds, we considered going home, but we thought, nah, let's blow it all. When we eventually return to the UK, it's true that we will really have nothing to return to. No money and no job, but we always have our amazing memories, and that's something not a lot of people will ever experience. The way we see it, we will eventually find a job and eventually buy a house. We have both just been lucky enough to travel the world. It was totally worth it. And so when we think about, who it is that we're serving people like Tom and Jess, people who are saving lots of money, who are been working for years. And sometimes when we're off and we're traveling, we get kind of caught up in the moment, and when we're sharing experiences, we forget that it's real people who are making these decisions. It's real people like Tom and Jess that we're working with and that we're working towards, that we're really serving with our blogs to help them travel better and perhaps to help them travel in a longer and different way.
So that gives you a sense of the buy side, right? The consumers that we appeal to as travel bloggers. Our next story actually takes a look at the sell side. So again, we're in New Zealand this time, and Audrey and I were intent on going hang gliding. And so here's a picture of Audrey totally enjoying herself up in the hang glider in the top end of the South Island of New Zealand outside of Abel Tasman National Park. And here's the next photo of me looking half terrified, just abiding the experience. Actually, there are even worse photos, and I really couldn't put one up where I'm there gritting my teeth. I have a problem with heights. I have to make
myself off buildings.
I know, and I'm throwing myself off buildings. I'm bungee jumping. I'm going hang gliding. It's really great. But the story is not about us. This story is about Trevor, the man underneath me, my hang glide master, and he and his wife run this business, doing hang gliding tours like this out of the South Island of New Zealand. And during our trip in New Zealand, one of our goals was to try as many activities like a travel blogger might, so that we could come up with a list of sort of suggested add-on activities for the tour that we were taking. And a number of those add-on activities were very easy to get free access to because our guide was Kiwi, and he was terrific, and he had all these relationships, and so everything was coming free, and it was great, free of charge. We felt like superstars. Well, he approached Trevor, and Trevor said, I'm not really sure. I think I actually want to talk to these guys face to face. And so we showed up a little bit early that morning before the launch, and I went up there, and I said to Trevor, I said, do you know who I am? No, I didn't. I didn't do that, and I don't recommend that you ever do that, for the record. So I said, you know, we're Dan and Audrey of Uncornered Market. We've been around for about 7 years. Here's a sense of our audience. Here's a sense of our social media profiles and networks, and this is what we plan to do. And then on top of that, we're doing a campaign with G Adventures, and they're going to be running more tours to New Zealand. And so I think this is actually going to be of interest because they have even larger, much larger social networks than we have. They're going to be sending more passengers. I think this would be a good thing. And he said, well, what is this really going to do for my business? Like, when am I going to start getting customers from this? You know, it's funny, we don't really get asked these types of questions very often, but it's perfectly reasonable, right? And I said, I can't promise you anything today, or this week, or even this month. It might even take a couple of months, but I think eventually they're going to come. And so I sort of went over the scenario again, and eventually he took us up and he terrified me, and this photo of me just barely abiding the hang glider. The reason that we bring these stories up of people is, I think in this industry it's very easy to kind of become disconnected, to become enamored with all of the travel, and to become enamored with all of the free stuff. Nothing makes me sadder than going on one of these forums and hearing someone complain that they didn't get something for free, when in fact there are a lot of consumers out there who are saving money, like the Toms and Jesses of the world, and making very difficult decisions. And even if they have all the money in the world and they're the richest luxury traveler, understand that they are making decisions regarding something that's very valuable to them, and that's their time. And then you have people like this who are running small businesses, and they say, I'm just not sure I can do any more freebies. I've got to pay for gas to get the plane up there. I've got to make sure that I cover expenses. And it's interesting when we have conversations like this because it really begins to root us into what is going on in the tourism business and what really matters.
And so there's, as mentioned on the Facebook forums especially, there's a lot of talk back and forth about integrity. But we'd like to pose this question is, what if integrity, if business and quality are not actually at odds after all? What if we are able to find the third way where we're honoring our readers, we're honoring the companies that we're working with, and we're doing so in such a way by being these interpreters and honoring the experience?
And I've got a short story about this, so I'm going to interrupt you because when it was announced that we were going to be keynoting here at TBEX, we were contacted via back channel email by a couple of people, and the single topic that kept coming up over and over again was one of integrity, something that our industry obviously has some challenges with because of a number of different circumstances. And I'll tell you, there's sort of two ends of the spectrum as we see it. On one end, you have what I might call the purists who say, under no circumstance should you go and work with a commercial enterprise or go and work with a company. You can't maintain your integrity if you do that. Well, as much as I am sympathetic towards their view regarding the trust of our audience, I think we can do something different, and I think we can do something better. And on the other end, you have people who we might call sellouts, who go after every last piece of real estate, and they'll sell down to the very last organ and their backside in order to make money. And the third way that Audrey is talking about is essentially an elegant sort of compromise of the two. And as you sort of thread that needle, the question is then, what am I here for, and what is my purpose? Which brings us to our final step, which is Act 4, the why.
Now, in terms of the why, I think it's all of us, whether it's success in business or success in life, it's always about having a purpose, something that's perhaps bigger than ourselves. And so with travel, I think a lot of you can probably, this sentence, you know, the idea, the transformational power of travel resonates with a lot of us. I mean, I imagine it's why many of you are sitting here right now in front of us, is because you had an incredible experience when you were traveling. You came back changed, you wanted to share it, and you wanted other people to have that incredible experience, and you wanted them to come back and share it with others. And so here you see a photo. It's from Ladakh, which is the high Himalayan mountains of India, and it's the Tibetan Buddhist part. And we went off on a 7-day trek in June. And in June, there's not really supposed to be snowstorms, but as you see, we got a surprise blizzard.
I'm so grateful that I'm smiling in this photo. Can I just tell you that?
Yeah, because 2 seconds before I took it, he was complaining about it was the worst day ever. But anyway, but that's
Talk about being called out.
But that's the idea of this transformational power of travel. You dig deep inside of you. It's not always glorious. It's not always sunshine and happy and butterflies. You know, you have these really challenging experiences. You push yourself to the limits. You push yourself beyond what you think is possible. and you come out the other side changed. You come out going home saying, I'm a different person, and perhaps you're also connecting with other people differently. But with travel, I'd like to think of it not just in terms of us as individuals and kind of us consuming it or us being the recipient of the transformational power of travel, but it's also the idea of what we can do with the local communities in the places that we're visiting. And so here you see a family that we stayed with. So after we came off the mountain, we went down into a village and we spent the night with them. And it was part of a homestay program. So we got a nice warm bed, really incredible home-cooked meal. They got a fixed fee for us staying there and for the services. And so while we had this great connection going back and forth, they were able to earn money in the summer in order to invest in their kids, in order to maybe invest in a couple of household kind of improvements and stuff. And so as we think of kind of the why, it's this idea of it's not just about me, but it's also about the places that we're visiting and being interpreters of those places.
Which brings us to another story. How many of you have been to Myanmar or Burma? Yeah, beautiful country, beautiful people. Fortunately, the situation there is looking up. But this is a photo that we took approximately 5 years ago at the beginning of 2008. And we visited Myanmar just after the beginning of the Saffron Uprising. And so there was a lot of news about unrest and instability, and so it drove away literally almost all of the tourists, to the point where the tourism industry in Myanmar was wiped out 85 to 90%. And so we found ourselves one day in the town of Bagan, and it's this beautiful plain dotted with Buddhist temples and things. And we cycled around, an absolutely beautiful day. We basically had the place to ourselves, which sounds really great until you understand that the community was really suffering because there was no one else there. And so we went back to our guest house and we got ourselves cleaned up, and then we went out that night and we walked down the street, and the lights were flickering because the electricity is always going on and off in Myanmar, it seems. And there were a couple of cute little restaurants with little Christmas lights dangling. And I'll tell you, it was the toughest decision we've almost ever had to make. Where do we go and eat when all of these places are empty? I don't know how we made the decision, but we walked into one of them, and there was a man there, and he was serving us, and he was also the owner. And he sat down, and we chatted with him, and I asked him, I said, how are things working out? And he said, this is terrible. He said, tourism has never been this bad for us. And he said, it's not just about me and my business, it's about really this entire community. He said, everyone is affected by this. The people who rent the bikes down the street, the people who run all of these guest houses, the people who supply all of us. He said, it's decimated. And it was interesting. He said something that I'll never forget that has meaning for us on so many levels. He said, tourism is the people's business. And I thought about this, and it made so much sense economically, because the money that we bring into communities and how meaningful it is to communities. This is the great power of tourism, global tourism around the world. But then I stepped back even further in terms of the meaning of this phrase, and I don't think he meant this. Tourism is the people's business. Perhaps the most underrated dimension of tourism is the people, when in fact, tourism does not function without people. They are the ones who get us there, they are the ones who feed us. And it also just so happens, after we've read all these blog posts, that some of the greatest stories that we carry back with us, they're because of the people that we met. So tourism is the people's business.
And I can tell you that there's a lot of people traveling these days. Last year, 1 billion people, 1 billion travelers crossed borders. So that doesn't even take into account, the domestic travelers. And so when you think of something on that scale, 1 billion people, almost the entire country of China traveling, imagine that. Think about what potential there is for harm. We've all, I imagine, have traveled to places where we've seen tourism development go extremely wrong, in terms of destroying the environment. Local people are unhappy and they're kind of jaded, and you might get scammed and things like that, and you kind of step back and think, oh my God, I'm contributing to this. Like, I'm helping to destroy places, and you think, what am I doing as a travel blogger? But if we flip it around, think about the potential for good with 1 billion travelers. Through what we're doing as storytellers, what we're doing with our content, how we're connecting with all of our readers all over the world, the reach of the stories and what we write, we have this ability to connect our readers to travel in such a way that they are traveling with respect. And this is respect for the environment, it's respect for the economy, and it's also respect for the local people and the culture. And so when we think about the travel industry and how it's growing, it's kind of we're part of this. We're part of helping this move forward, and we're part of helping it turn travel and the tourism industry into this potential for good.
Which brings us to one final anecdote. A couple of years ago, a good friend of mine asked, he said, "Why are you doing this?" And honestly, I've sort of struggled. I said, it certainly isn't for the money, because there's a number of other industries that could probably serve me in a much better way. And I said, I think it's because I want to leave this planet a shade better off than if I had otherwise not existed. And later that year, Václav Havel died. He was the former president of the Czech Republic, and he was instrumental in the fall of communism. And after his death, a number of stories came out, including a number of quotes from his work. And one of the quotes that really struck me, that sort of put a fine point on why we in particular are in this business, and why I suspect many of us are in this business, was this quote. He says, "Hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. It's the idea that we're doing the right thing, not because we're guaranteed some result, but we're doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do." Travel is the greatest platform for personal transformation and personal growth. It is so powerful. It is the ultimate tool of connection. It is the ultimate tool of cultural understanding. We would even suggest it's perhaps the greatest tool for peace and positive global change. And so as you're sort of reflecting on the conference here, one thing I'd like to offer is that at the end of our life, it's said that a reel is played of all of those kind of highlight moments. And the question is, what are those highlight moments that are going to be on that reel? And I often wonder sort of what questions we're going to ask ourselves. And are we going to ask ourselves, how successful were we? Or more importantly, how did we measure success? And I realize it's difficult because we're kind of in a bit of a balancing act here. And so as you walk out of here armed with all of this knowledge and you feel the landscape shifting under your feet, because that's the nature of this business, perhaps you'll close your eyes and you'll consider the what, the how, your why, and the who, and you'll reflect on ways to better honor the experience, the loyalty and trust of your readers and your audience, and also the communities and the people that you visit around the world. Thanks so much for listening.
Great job. Great job.
Thank you.